Hey beauties, I'm Meghan Norean, your resident womb witch and cyclical guide. I invite you on a journey with me through the landscape of cycle awareness, social justice, and spirituality as we follow the embodied path of womb, earth, and moon. Welcome to Lunarscape. I'm coming to you today from the hills of Darjeeling, where it actually feels like autumn, with crisp, cool air and a foggy mist that adds to the spookiness of the season we are in. While we're on vacation, I have been relaxing, but I have been working really hard on my new course as well, Cyclementary. And the invitation is there for anyone that wants to connect to the power and wisdom of your menstrual cycle and look at the intersections of how your cycle affects your physical, emotional, and spiritual landscapes. This is an invitation to come home to yourself and your cyclical nature. And it all starts on November 8th. You can find more information at meghannoreen.com/cyclementary. Your cycle news today comes from the United States, where this week Amy Coney Barrett was confirmed to the Supreme Court, making it a 6-3 conservative-leaning court in the highest court of the United States. Now, why might this come under cycle news? Because there is a huge speculation that the case Roe versus Wade will be coming onto the table for the Supreme Court to decide upon. Now, Roe versus Wade is a case that was back in the 70s that allowed abortions to be legalized federally in the United States. Now, in a world where holistic education on the menstrual cycle and sex is basically non-existent in school curriculums, we are expecting people with wombs to educate themselves on their fertility or visiting a doctor that believes in only prescribing hormonal contraceptives without giving explicit informed consent, and then telling them that they cannot receive an abortion because their contraceptive failed, or they didn't understand what days in their cycle they were fertile, or even if they were raped or victims of incest. And all of this is not even to mention that all of these arguments for pro-life put all of the responsibility on the person with a womb, even though people with wombs are only fertile for around 5 days of their entire menstrual cycle, where sperm can be fertile every single day. So if Roe is overturned and making abortions federally illegal, this is going to leave it up to the state by state. And there is an expectation that 22 states will also make abortion illegal. Now, this is going to disproportionately affect people who are poor and women of color. This leaves people who are reliant on public transportation with increasing travel times if they have to cross state lines to reach an abortion clinic, or who don't have access to childcare or can afford to take time off of work to receive that abortion care. This will likely increase illegal surgical abortions and having people ordering abortion pills from unknown providers online. And this is not even to say that people who are not even just wanting abortions. It is going to affect those who need surgeries after miscarriages or stillbirths, ectopic pregnancies, people who are doing IVF and do selective reduction, or birth control even is considered abortions to some pro-lifers. And also the lives of the people that may have pregnancy complications like preeclampsia or certain genetic markers that would make it impossible for the baby to become fully developed. By making abortions illegal would make it impossible for those people to receive the medical care that they need. Before Roe versus Wade, 17% of the maternal mortality rates in the United States was from illegal abortions. People getting unsafe abortions, because let's make it clear, people are not going to stop getting abortions. It is just going to make it riskier for them to do so. And this is not even to mention that today the US has the highest maternal mortality rate in all of the developed countries in the world. And this increases when we look at people of color and specifically Black people. These pro-lifers like Amy Coney Barrett are only interested in one thing: the life of the unborn fetus. They do not care what happens in education except to preach abstinence, or to facilitate easier access to birth control, or addressing poverty levels that make the idea of another mouth to feed impossible, or social support structures that could create sustainable family environments. And the fact that honoring people with wombs, that they have their own body sovereignty and body autonomy. So until there is a comprehensive and continuing free menstrual cycle and sex and fertility education at every level of schooling, and until there are open conversations in our homes, in our communities about the menstrual cycle and sex and fertility, and until things like rape and incest stop, there is always going to be a need for abortion clinics. What can we do now? If you are a US citizen, now is the time to practice your right to vote. Check your state. A lot of states accept late mail-in ballots. You can still mail in your ballot and it can still be counted up to a week, 10 days after the election on the 3rd. Or get out to those polls if you have not already done early voting or sent in your mail voting. Make sure you get to a poll on the 3rd to express your right to vote. When you are voting, think about who is benefiting from your vote. The other thing we can do now is to donate to abortion clinics or organizations like Planned Parenthood, and research the school district that you are in, where your kids go to school, and see what kind of education that is currently there and how there can be an opening for more inclusive, holistic education about menstrual cycles and sex and fertility, so that ideally people can have their own body autonomy and can make the decisions that are best for themselves. All right, time for my personal cycle check-in. Today I am cycle day 19. I am in the crossover land between my inner summer and my inner autumn. This is a great time to celebrate yourself and fill your cup up with gratitude as you complete the summer and turn into the autumn, turning back inwards. So today I am grateful for those who have already signed up for Cyclementary, and for those who are feeling the call to join us in this first kickoff of the group online course. I'm also thankful for the 5 days, these last 5 days in the mountains, and being able to connect to nature in a way that I cannot back in Kolkata. As I move forward in my cycle, I am taking stock of what still needs to get done in this last season and taking the time to really let go of what I no longer need to hold on to, letting those leaves fall as they may. So, where are you in your cycle today, and how are you feeling? Let's get into our episode for today. We are talking about the Wheel of the Year, and specifically Samhain. So if you're not familiar with the Wheel of the Year, this comes from in ancient Celtic traditions following the agricultural and seasonal cycles of the earth. This includes the 2 solstices, the summer solstice and the winter solstice, as well as the equinoxes, the spring equinox and autumn equinox, as well as 4 cross-quarter days. So I'll briefly go through all 8 of them. There are 8 markers along the wheel of the year that the Earth cycles through. And it starts with Samhain. Samhain is known as the new year in the wheel of the year. It is the end of the wheel of the year as well as the very beginning of the next year. So Samhain is now celebrated on the eve of October the 31st through the eve of November the 1st. And then as we move along the wheel of the year, the next one comes to Yule, or the winter solstice, and then to Imbolc, which is on February 1st, flowing into Ostara, or spring equinox, then to Beltane, which is on May 1st, then Litha, the summer solstice, and then Lunarscape, which is on August 1st, and then Mabon, which is the autumn equinox, coming back around again to Samhain, which is where we find ourselves today. So after the Roman influence on the Celtics people and adopting of the Gregorian calendar, Samhain date was fixed to the eve of October the 31st through the eve of November the 1st. But the ancient peoples closely connected to the land and the subtle differences, that happened throughout the seasons and the changing of the seasons, would celebrate Samhain on the first frost after the full moon in the month of October. So as I said, Samhain marks the ending of one cycle and is the beginning of another. This is an ancient pagan celebration marking the end of the harvest season. There are 3 harvest festivals within the wheel of the year, and Samhain being the last of the harvest festival. And it marks the beginning of the long, dark, and winter months. If you are familiar with menstrual cycle awareness and the work of the Red School, you might be familiar with the terms the via positiva and the via negativa. The via positiva is the time in our menstrual cycles between menstruation leading up into ovulation, and then the via negativa from ovulation leading down into menstruation. So it's this, the positiva is the building of energy, and the negativa is the waning of energy, just like the waxing and the waning of the moon as well. So Samhain is the marker for the beginning of winter, of the darker, half of the year, that very much in that via negativa part of the cycle. So the ancient Celtic people always started the beginning of the year with the beginning of the darkness. So they believed that darkness came before the light. And this is why Samhain is known as the beginning of the year. And if you're wondering about the name Samhain, it is Gaelic for the summer's end. So we can clearly see this via positiva energy, this summer energy is ending, and we are now in the negativa, in the darker winter months. If we look at the inner seasons of our menstrual cycle, this would be the crossover between the inner autumn and the inner winter. Really coming into those more reflective, slow down, let go time of the cycle, and as well as that space of more permeability, which also happens at Samhain. So Samhain, and on the opposite side of the wheel is Beltane on May 1st. And these 2 festivals were considered the greater fire festivals, the greater of the 4 cross-quarter days. And it was believed that at these 2 points, the veil between the world this world, the living world, and the other world, the world of the spirits, the fairies, the ancestors, became thinnest during this time. This is the transition between the via positiva and the via negativa. And in these transition times is when that veil becomes thin and the world becomes more permeable between the living and the dead. So at this time, those of the other world, they are able more easily to come into the world of the living, and the world of the living is able to get a glimpse into the other world. This makes Samhain in this time perfect for divination and seeking out guidance from the other world. Being able to see into a future that has not yet happened, but yet in this time of permeability, the concept of time itself is broken down, and we are able to get a glimpse of something that might hold us in our future. And it also is support from our ancestors, from the spirits of beyond, to guide us in a way that is most beneficial for us and for, our planetary revolution. So with this idea of the thinning of the veil comes the common themes of Samhain, such as death and the supernatural. And these concepts have been carried from the earliest days of the festival of Samhain to the modern days festivals of Halloween that we see here in our current culture. And it also brings up this theme of the shadow and taking time to look within ourselves at specific shadow aspects we might still be carrying on from our past. And it is an invitation to begin new again and allow those shadows to, be resurrected, be healed, and then be laid to rest so that we can move into our future and the beginning anew. Let's take a look at the actual practices that the more ancient pagans would have been practicing at this time. So, as I mentioned, they would be coming to this time at the first frost after the full moon in October. And when this first frost would have appeared, that day they would allow their hearth fire in their home to go out. They would bring their animals in from grazing the fields, and they would have the druid, the druidess priest or priestess light a community fire. This large community bonfire would be lit throughout the night, and then the people would light torches from this communal fire, or they would use a turnip lantern, a carved out turnip, to carry the embers, which is some of the foundation of the jack-o'-lantern that we know nowadays. So they would take the light from this large communal bonfire, and they would take that to light the hearth in their home. And it was seen as very unlucky to have your hearth fire go out at Samhain night. So it would be very important for somebody to stay tending to that hearth fire throughout that night of Samhain. And as these people were very connected to the agricultural cycles of the land, they would also take torches to light from the communal bonfire and put these torches surrounding their land, their farming land. And it would be one of protection from the maybe more sinister spirits and fairies that could harm their land, but also the fire and the ash from the fire would have more practical uses of protecting the fields from invasive plants that would come in the following year. This would also be a time of preparation for the winter. Communities needed to make sure they had enough food for the months ahead, as they were reliant on what was available in their local community. And as growing food in the winter would not be possible, so they would make sure that they would gather all of the food they could from the harvest. They would celebrate the harvest that they had and take time to preserve the food to carry through the winter months. As well as they would use this time as for slaughtering the animals, representing that theme of death and completion of the cycle. All of these fire lightings and the gathering of food and the slaughtering of animals was all to make sure that the home and the hearth fire had protection throughout the winter. Also, there was housing made available for the traveling healers and the warriors from the community, as they were all gathering back home to rest for the winter. This was really the height of the communal festivals, like a homecoming where everybody is coming home, even the ancestors from the other world, everybody coming home to gather together. And one practice that they used to gather their ancestors from the other world was called a dumb supper. This was a supper that was taken part together and an invitation to invite the ancestors to dine with you, setting a place on the table or offering food at the window or the door of the house, knowing so that the ancestors knew that it was safe and welcoming to come and visit. People would often light candles and place them in windows so that the ancestors could be guided home. They would then take this time during the supper, you would stay silent. And then after the supper, you would take time. The children would play games, sing songs, and the elders would share stories and events that had happened throughout the past year, so that the ancestors were kept up to date of all the going on of the land and the community. So while Samhain has some very, serious rituals and places of connection with ancestors and rituals for protection from, more sinister spirits or fairies, it also coincides with a more silly and mischievous side of human nature, when at this time people would often do pranks or mischief trying to fool the fairies, or they would practice pranks and then blame it on the fairies. So it is this paradox between the being serious and the being silly, which we can often see practice in our traditional practices of Halloween today as well. The practice of trick-or-treating and dressing up can also come from these ancient Celtic practices, where the men and boys would dress up like animals, often in the animal skins of the slaughtered, and animal heads to ward off these evil fairies that may try and kidnap you on the night of, Samhain, because the veil is thin. They would also travel around to different houses, offering to keep these evil fairies at bay in exchange for food. Later on in time, this became known as mumming or souling, which became popular among children, specifically children who were poor, to travel around singing and saying rhymes for the departed souls. in exchange for what was called a soul cake, which was a cookie with a cross on it. This was adopted after, Christianity tried to convert the pagans by repurposing their holidays. When they tried to repurpose the holiday of Samhain, Christianity created the holiday of All Saints' Day and All Souls' Day, which is on November 1st and 2nd, respectively, and became a remembrance and an honoring of the saints and the martyrs of the Christian faith. But these holidays failed to replace some of the Samhain traditions, and they got pushed then onto October 31st, or what we call All Hallows Eve, aka Halloween. So this tradition of trick or treat actually did not become a common saying until the 1950s, and it is because of a Charlie Brown comic strip that made this popular. And the secular holiday that we now know as Halloween did not become popular in the United States until the 1970s, and then in other parts of the world later in time. And now, if you look outside, if you go to a store, you will largely see that Halloween has been taken over by capitalist interests to sell costumes and candy. So if you are of a Celtic ancestry, or you're interested in these pagan wheel of the year that connects to the earthly cycles and the agricultural seasons that are seen within the land, there are ways that you can connect to these traditions even today, and there are a lot of modern pagans that are reinventing, reimagining what these traditions could look like, creating rituals and spells, a lot of them specifically to connect to the ancestors at this time, a time to honor the year that has passed and celebrate a new year that is coming, things to prepare for the winter months that are coming ahead, and really just a time to slow down, to take stock, to find those places of rest, to gather as a community and really honoring what has been and looking forward to what will come. So if you are looking for ways to connect to these traditions of Samhain, one that your ancestors would have celebrated, here are some rituals that you may enjoy. You might like to participate in a dumb supper, where you will gather people of your family or your community and you will invite the ancestors to join you, offering food and a place at the table for them to sit, and having a meal in silence as they join you. Then taking the time to share stories or events that have happened from the previous year, honoring the presence of the ancestors, thanking them, and then sending them on their way as they pass back over into the other world. You may like to have a bonfire to light the fire of the cold nights passing between autumn and winter, and you could light a candle from the bonfire to bring in your house, representative as the hearth fires that I'm sure many of us do not have in our homes these days. Something that I really enjoyed was looking up the divination practices, and as well as the traditional divination practices of tarot or oracle cards, practicing scrying, practicing with your pendulum, etc. There was also a practice working with an apple, and since this is apple season, the harvest season of apples, This is specifically for those that are single at the moment and looking for love. You can peel an apple in one long slice, as one long spiral around the apple, and throw this peel over your shoulder. And as you look behind you, look to see what letter may form in the peel, and that will be your next partner's name. Other things you may do at this time could be to visit a cemetery or a graveyard and clean debris from gravestones that may have been neglected for a while, placing flowers on the gravestones of the departed, and whether they are your ancestors or not, this is a time to just really honor those that have gone before us. You can also create an ancestor altar if you want to honor your own ancestors with photos, objects that have passed down, heirlooms in your family. You can write out the memories you have of different ancestors or family members, and you can place those all on an altar as you honor your ancestors for Samhain. You can make recipes with the foods that are prevalent during this time of the harvest, with pumpkin, kale, apples, and or nuts, and make a feast with this in celebration of the earth and all of its abundance that it has given us for this season. And one of my favorite rituals that I found that I would love to see in neighborhoods across the country, across the world, was called a candle chain, where you will light a candle and take another candle to light from the first candle and give that second candle to your neighbor. Then they will take one of their candles, lighting it from the candle you have given them, and they will pass it on to the next neighbor. And then the candle chain continues on throughout the community as a way of asking for prayer and protection for the coming winter months, and as a way to light our path throughout these coming colder, darker winter months ahead. So I'd love to hear if any of you have your own traditions for Samhain. How do you celebrate? How do you honor this marking of the season for Samhain or Halloween? And you've made it to the end of this podcast and have enjoyed the first few episodes of Lunarscape. I would ask you to write a review on Apple Podcasts. Would be great, and a great way for more people to learn about Lunarscape and what cyclical living is all about. And as well as you can support this podcast and the time it takes to create it by becoming a Patreon for as little as $3 a month. You can find that at patreon.com/Meghan Norean. And I wish you all a very blessed Samhain. May you find yourself reaching through the veil to the other world and discovering magic that is held within you and within the world.